Imagine you're on top of the world as a badass MMA fighter, undefeated in every fight you step into. People everywhere worship the ground you walk on, calling you the strongest human alive, all at just 27 years old. But the moment you decide to retire and live a peaceful and wealthy life, a truck comes out of nowhere and gives you a smooth kiss, sending you directly to the afterlife. However, that's not even the craziest part. Next, you wake up in the same body but in a whole new realm, stripped of your glory and forced to work as a slave every day, or else end up dead at the hands of goblins. This is the story of a 27-year-old virgin named Choi Hyunseok, who couldn't help but cry over how easily he died just when he was finally about to enjoy life. The worst part? He had never dated a girl in his entire life, and now he'd never get the chance. However, it only took him half an hour to realize that maybe being dead wasn't so bad after all. He had no family, no friends, and no one who cared about him. On top of that, he no longer had to deal with daily, exhausting training. Just as he was wallowing in those thoughts, the space in front of him started glowing, catching his attention. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the light, and a cute angel appeared. She called him by some fancy name, SSS rank hero, and apologized for being late. She introduced herself as Rachel, a headhunter who scouts people whose lives ended on Earth. Sook was completely captivated by her breathtaking beauty and couldn't focus on anything she was saying. Then, out of nowhere, the angel grabbed his hand and told him she was giving him two options. The first was to accept his fate and wait to be reincarnated into his next life as a pitiful old bachelor. The second option was to be resurrected in another world as a famous hero that every girl dreams of spending a night with. However, Sook didn't rush to choose between the two options. Instead, he awkwardly asked Rachel if she could give him a little more time to think it through. The angel stepped closer and tried to convince Sook that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, offering everything a man could ever dream of. She told him he shouldn't let it slip away so easily. But the thought of having to fight again, this time not just as a fighter but as a hero, was the reason for his hesitation. All he really wanted was a peaceful life, something he had always longed for. Rachel, however, wasn't the type to give up easily. For some unknown reason, she was insistent that the boy accept her offer without delay. Determined, she tried to explain things differently to help him lean toward choosing the life of a hero. This time, she used a doll to act out a scenario. As soon as Choi reincarnated as a hero, he would meet a village chief who would assign him simple, easy quests, nothing difficult or dangerous. Once he completed the tasks, the chief would reward him with his only daughter, who also happened to be the most beautiful girl on the entire continent. Even after seeing this little demonstration, the boy looked even more confused. He didn't seem any closer to making a decision and showed no signs of leaning toward the hero life. Seeing Sook's expression, Rachel quickly realized her first plan had completely failed. Without missing a beat, she moved on to her backup plan. Suddenly, the angel turned around and started to walk away, making it clear she was disappointed in the boy. She wished him good luck living as a pitiful old bachelor and casually reminded him that there was no guarantee he'd even reincarnate as a human in his next life. Her plan worked perfectly. After all, the last thing Sook wanted was to come back as some ugly bachelor animal. Panicking, he jumped into action, grabbed Rachel's feet, and started begging, saying he'd do whatever she wanted. At first, the angel pretended not to hear him, asking him to repeat what he just said. This time, Sook, still clinging tightly to her feet, shouted at the top of his lungs that he'd become a hero. A satisfied smile spread across Rachel's face as her second plan worked like a charm. Without wasting any time, Angel Rachel got straight to work, preparing to send the boy to his new life, something he wasn't expecting to happen so quickly. As a glowing teleportation circle appeared beneath him, Rachel cheerfully announced there was no point in wasting time here when a wonderful new world was waiting for him. The thought of being sent to another world without any proper preparation was terrifying, but his complaints fell on deaf ears as the angel sent him off without giving him a chance to voice his concerns. Once her job was done, Rachel's mood completely shifted. She was all smiles, feeling relieved after spending so much time convincing Sook to do what she wanted. But just as she was about to relax, she got a call from someone. She quickly reported that Sook's transmigration was successfully completed as promised, and then casually asked for her commission as per their deal. Moments later, the protagonist found himself lying on a wooden bed, half asleep, hearing, or maybe dreaming, about someone trying to wake him up. He figured it must be the village chief that Rachel had mentioned, here to give him the easy task she described. Feeling confident about what was coming, Suk thought it would be a piece of cake to handle. However, his peaceful moment was brutally interrupted when a heavy blow struck his stomach. He shot up from the bed in an irritated mood, ready to confront whoever dared to wake him up in such a manner. But the sight that greeted him left him completely stunned. A massive orc stood in front of him, wearing a bull skull on its head, shouting furiously about how he dared to sleep in the slave dormitory at this hour of the day. For a moment, the protagonist thought this must really be the village chief, the one who was supposed to offer him his daughter after completing simple quests. So he respectfully sat on the bed and introduced himself as the hero, without mentioning his real name. The orc stepped closer, looked him up and down, and then, to Choi's surprise, muttered, "Heroes these days? Really this stupid?" Choi blinked in confusion, wondering if he'd somehow done something wrong. This guy didn't seem like the kind and welcoming village chief Rachel had described. Still, he convinced himself that a sweet and beautiful angel like Rachel wouldn't lie to him for no reason. He realized this must be some kind of test, a challenge, or maybe a tutorial quest to kickstart his journey in this new world, and he just needed to take down this opponent. But the aura radiating from the bull-headed orc sent chills down his spine. It was overwhelming, and for a moment he hesitated. Still, as a former professional Korean fighter, Choi decided he couldn't back down now. Fear or not, he had to face this head-on. All of a sudden, he sprang into action, aiming a kick straight for the orc's weak spot, confident he could take out this flimsy tutorial monster with nothing but a swift kick. He gave it his all. His foot struck its target dead on, but to his shock, the blow barely fazed the red orc. The creature didn't even stumble. It just stood there, looking more annoyed than anything else. The situation took a turn when a monster grabbed the boy's leg midair, mocking him and questioning how a so-called hero could be such a weakling. The creature started squeezing Choi's leg, angrily muttering about how tired he was of dealing with foolish humans like this. Suk immediately felt sharp pain in his leg, but things went from bad to worse when Riadron prepared to strike back, snarling about teaching the self-proclaimed hero a lesson. Choi could sense the danger, but he was in no condition to dodge or block the attack. Hours later, Suk woke up in an underground prison, thrashing around and shouting for a rematch with Riadron, the cow-headed orc. His desperate cries echoed through the cell until the door suddenly creaked open. This time, a goblin entered, carrying a massive blood-stained sword on his shoulder. The goblin glared at him and growled, "Why have you been such a pain in the ass lately?" The sight of the goblin and his sword scared the life out of Choi, who instantly promised to stay quiet from now on. Before leaving, the goblin warned him, "If you pull something like this again, I'll turn you into meat soup." Left alone with his thoughts once again, the boy found himself drowning in questions about how he ended up here, feeling nothing like the hero the angel had claimed he would be. The fact that he might die again as a virgin was only making his mood worse. Suddenly, a voice from a small window called out to him, snapping him out of his thoughts. Choi couldn't help but wonder who was on the other side. The voice introduced himself as a senior who was about to become a hero soon. The man went on to reveal that they were being held in the Demon King's army fortress, a place where humans were enslaved. Recognizing the man's accent, Choi immediately realized he was Korean and eagerly asked if he knew why they had been imprisoned there. Seeing how curious the boy was, the man started shouting loudly, "Hey, self-proclaimed heroes, are you still alive? The real hero who's come to save us is finally here." It turned out the two of them weren't the only ones locked in that prison, as others began shouting for help too, each one claiming to be a hero. This only made Choi feel even more confused. Sensing this, the man decided to explain everything he knew to the bewildered newcomer. According to the guy, the one in charge of this place is the orc with a bull skull on his head, known as Riadron. The goblins, like the one Choi encountered earlier, are the prison guards here. But what he said next about Rachel completely shocked Choi. He claimed that all of them ended up here because of her, calling her a wicked demon. The guy doubted whether she had sent them here on purpose or if it was some kind of mistake. Hearing this, Choi couldn't help but ponder if he wasn't really supposed to be there. He decided to double-check if the guy's information was legit. The man confidently reassured him, saying he had pieced everything together from the other so-called heroes locked up in different areas of the fortress. According to his findings, heroes usually start their journey in the middle of bustling cities or quiet rural villages. That's how it's supposed to happen. But in their case, it seemed Angel Rachel had tricked them and sent them to the wrong place entirely. In just a few seconds, it all started to sink in. Choi was convinced he was about to live a miserable, harsh life in this place, all because he fell for that cute angel's sweet words. Worse yet, he was probably going to die as a virgin again. Hours later, the scene shifted to another part of the fortress where goblin soldiers were guarding a group of slaves hard at work. Among them was Sook, who was being forced to carry a massive tree trunk on his shoulder while begrudgingly singing the work song. Let's crush the humans, let's devour the humans. Every word of that song made his blood boil. Just then, the goblin on top of the tree loudly announced that their work for the day was done and they were dismissed. Barely containing his anger, Choi clenched his fists and silently promised himself, "One day, I'll tear that goblin limb from limb." Exhausted and seething, he returned to his cell and lay down, trying to catch his breath. As he stared at the cold, damp walls of the prison, he couldn't help but think, staying in this freezing cell is way better than working in that godforsaken yard as a slave. Suddenly, a memory of Rachel flashed in his mind. He recalled the moment she mentioned that as a hero in another world, he would be able to see his status in a special window. At first, Choi scoffed at the idea, thinking it was probably just another one of her lies. But after some thought, he decided to give it a try. Gathering his courage, he uttered the words, "status window," feeling a little ridiculous. To his shock, something actually happened. In an instant, a glowing window appeared in front of him, displaying his abilities, strength, and a host of other information. Seeing a system window like this for the first time, the boy couldn't help but wonder what all these numbers meant. Muttering to himself about having 31 stamina, he was suddenly interrupted by the other guy, shouting in disbelief, "Wait, you already have 31 stamina?" It was then that Choi realized the other guy had been spying on him. The Korean man couldn't believe someone could have 31 stamina right at level 1. But when he learned that Sook was a champion in his past life, it started to make more sense. However, Choi showed zero interest in discussing his stats any further. "Doesn't matter how strong I am," he said flatly. "As long as I'm still a slave, it's useless." With that, he lay down on the cold floor and covered his ears, trying to block out the other guy's overly enthusiastic words of encouragement. The protagonist wasn't in the mood for small talk or making friends. For now, he just wanted to be left alone, or at least to pretend as much. Time flew by, and it was about the middle of the night when the boy returned to check his status again, hoping there were no intruders this time. Two things caught his eye. First was mana, which he believed could be used later for superhuman abilities, and second, hero points. However, he had no idea what the hero points were all about. Despite his curiosity, he tried to ask other proclaimed heroes about it, but none of them had any clue. Suddenly, the space in front of him began to glow once more, just like the day he died. Out of thin air, someone jumped out, someone with huge melons that distracted the boy. Surprisingly, it was Rachel, who appeared, asking the boy to let her explain what hero points were all about. However, something about Rachel was different from her previous appearance. This time, she looked much smaller, and her angelic wings were gone. Without waiting for Choi Hyunseok's response, she immediately began explaining the concept of hero points, how heroes could earn them by completing quests and then use them to gain or improve their abilities. But before Rachel could finish her explanation, Choi suddenly grabbed her tightly, like catching a sparrow, his expression terrifying. "I don't care about hero points as long as I have you in my grasp," Choi declared. After everything he had endured in this harsh life, because of her, all he wanted was to make her pay for his own satisfaction. Minutes later, after giving her a rough punishment, he tied Rachel to the tip of what looked like a fishing hook and demanded that she confess why she had sent him to this strange place instead of the village he was supposed to arrive at. It didn't take long for her to spill the truth. With a sad and apologetic look, Rachel explained that it wasn't intentional. She hadn't meant to trick him or anyone else. She had made a mistake because of an unknown error in her teleportation skill, something she hadn't been aware of. Looking genuinely regretful, Rachel admitted that she was now here to serve him as her punishment. She promised to be his personal fairy, staying by his side until the day he defeated the Demon King. However, Choi showed no interest in accepting Rachel as his personal fairy, or in her word about being a hero or defeating the Demon Lord. He left Rachel stunned as he turned his back on her and announced that all he wanted was to live a normal life, with no intention of fighting anyone. His reasons for ignoring Rachel and everything she tried to explain were simple, partly because he didn't trust her and partly because he was still angry at her. Rachel was left speechless as she watched Choi completely dismiss her and go straight to bed. But then she remembered who she was dealing with. The same clueless guy who only knew how to fight and dreamed of nothing except having a harem of curvy women. Realizing her situation, the fairy started to panic, wondering what would happen to her if he refused to live the life of a warrior. Memories of the day she was demoted from a high-ranking angel to a personal fairy flashed through her mind. Back then, she found herself kneeling in front of God, begging for forgiveness for her mistake. Rachel had cried like a child that day, pleading for any other punishment, anything but this, but it was no use. God's decision was final, and now she was stuck with Choi Hyunseok, whether she liked it or not. That was the last thing she remembered before Choi snapped her back to reality, reminding her that a personal fairy should simply do whatever their master says. He asked her to listen to him and not do anything against his will. All of a sudden, the cell door swung open and Choi leaped out of bed, frantically trying to hide Rachel. A group of goblins appeared out of nowhere, looking to snatch him for some unknown reason. In a hushed tone, Rachel whispered that she could easily use her stealth skill to hide, so he didn't need to squish her. Then, one of the goblins, wielding a massive sword, announced with a scare that the prison boss, Sir Riadrun, wanted to see him immediately. Without argument, Choi found himself in the cow-headed orc's office, curious to know why he had been summoned. As soon as he got in the office, Riadrun blurted out, "I've heard you've been working hard lately." Choi was shocked, since that wasn't true. It seemed the goblin who liked to ride on his shoulder was the one who had exaggerated his work ethic, only because he enjoyed using Choi as a horse. The orc boss stated he never expected to hear any compliments about Choi after his shady antics on the first day. Then, as a form of appreciation, or perhaps as a twisted reward, he offered Choi the top slave position in the prison, shocking everyone. It turned out Riadrun was scheming to exploit the new boy to speed up their building project. All the while, Rachel was whispering in Choi's ear to refuse Riadrun's offer immediately. Seeing how Choi ignored her, Rachel grew furious and started yelling, trying to remind him that no hero should ever work for the Demon Lord's army. Even though she used her stealth skill to hide, her voice was still loud enough for others to hear. That's when the goblin and Riadrun started to grow curious about where the girl's voice was coming from. To change the subject and avoid suspicion, Choi hurriedly accepted Riadrun's offer, bowing low and even hitting his head on the desk on purpose. His quick move worked, and both the goblin and orc forgot about Rachel's voice. Instead, they were suddenly impressed by how respectful Choi's behavior had become. After that, with nothing else to discuss and tears in his eyes, Choi was dismissed from the office and left with no other choice. A few days later, in the fortress yard where slaves were being forced to sing yet another gruesome song about killing and devouring humans, someone stood at the top of a tower, watching and giving orders. Surprisingly, it was Choi Hyunseok, fully embracing his new role as the head slave. For him, it was a win-win situation, as now he didn't have to work as hard as the other slaves and could secretly develop some of his hidden skills, like charisma. In just a few days, his behavior had changed so much that even the humans around him started to doubt if he was really the same person as before, or if he had become one of the Demon Lord's men. Rachel tried her hardest to convince Choi to change his mind, but he had already decided what to do and simply told the fairy to trust the process. Nothing else. When he saw a slave collapse to the ground, he immediately started yelling at the guy, blaming him for being weak. Right after that, the system popped up again, announcing that Riadrun's favorability toward Choi had increased, and he was now just a few steps away from achieving his goal. Without hesitation, Choi headed straight to Riadrun's office, showing respect and expressing his gratitude, even though he wasn't sure if the cow-headed orc was actually watching him at that moment. Meanwhile, Rachel was rapidly losing her patience. She couldn't stand seeing Choi act this way just to please the demons, and she began shouting, demanding to know why he was doing all this. Covering his ears, or perhaps just scratching his head in frustration, Choi asked Rachel to calm down, explaining that he was only doing it because the system told him to. But Rachel couldn't believe that a system created by the gods would ask a hero to raise a demon's favorability. To prove his point, Choi summoned the system window and showed her the exact message. Even then, Rachel refused to believe it. The message also contained some insulting remarks about her, which only made her cry, feeling even more abandoned by the gods. It seemed this message had popped up for the first time after they left Ryodrun's office, when Choi was about to sleep. But Rachel was so furious that she demanded an explanation before letting him rest so easily that night. Instead of giving her a convincing answer to calm her down, Choi grabbed her in his fist and squeezed her tiny body, angrily blaming her for forcing him into accepting the request. It was at that moment that, all of a sudden, a system window appeared with a new quest. It stated that Choi had ended up in this situation because of a foolish mistake made by an idiot, and, to make up for that mistake, it was offering him a chance to escape. However, to unlock that chance, he first needed to earn Ryodrun's favor. At that moment, Choi couldn't help but wonder what all of this was about. After some time spent thinking, he finally began to figure it out. Back in the present, he was acting as if he were a high-ranking demon in the Demon King's army, ordering and shouting at slaves with a satisfied smile on his ugly face. From Rachel's perspective, none of this made any sense. Not the system message, nor Choi's behavior. Right then, the goblin who enjoyed riding on Choi's back showed up again and told him that Sir Ryodrun was asking for his presence. Without wasting much time, Choi arrived at Ryodrun's office to see what was the reason of his summoning. To his surprise, the cow-headed orc announced that he had received numerous reports that the slaves' productivity had increased drastically, all thanks to Choi. In response, Choi started spouting some ridiculous answers, basically implying that he hadn't done anything worth mentioning, and that any improvement was because of Sir Ryodrun himself. His silly responses only made Rachel even more disappointed in him. However, unlike Rachel, Ryodrun seemed to like Choi even more. The boy's answer boosted the orc's favorability further, completing Choi's first quest and earning him 100 hero points, something Rachel never expected to happen so suddenly. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Choi Hyunseok already had a plan in mind. After completing this quest, he stepped forward to Ryodrun's desk and respectfully asked for permission to train the slaves. Ryodrun looked surprised and asked what exactly Choi meant by training the slaves. Completely prepared for this moment, Choi confidently explained his idea, casually painting a picture for Ryodrun. Imagine a group of elite worker slaves moving in perfect unison, slaves who were disciplined experts, doing their tasks with precision and zero laziness. If we train them, they could finish the fortress construction in less than a week. His speech was persuasive, and Ryodrun seemed intrigued, though the red orc still had his doubts. He questioned whether humans, with their weak and fragile bodies, could really handle such intense training on top of their regular work. Despite this, Choi's suggestion had definitely caught Ryodrun's attention. At that moment, Choi played a sneaky trick, declaring that if this plan worked, it would be a huge achievement for Ryodrun. He even hinted that the higher-ups might hear about it, so why not give him a chance to try? This time, Ryodrun was convinced and agreed to let Choi do whatever he wanted to train the other slaves. Naturally, Choi expressed his gratitude. Since it was already late, they returned to the cell. But Rachel started crying again, declaring that her hero had lost his mind and didn't know what he was doing. She lamented how unlucky she was to be forced to live and work as the subordinate of this idiot hero. Seeing Rachel crying over and over for no real reason, Choi found it incredibly annoying. That's when he decided to reveal that he actually had a solid plan. At first, Rachel didn't believe him. She assumed Choi was just messing with her again, as usual. But this time he was serious. Choi confidently declared that his real goal was to train the human slaves and, at the right moment, start a rebellion. Sharing just a bit of his insight, he explained that the number of soldiers in the demon army and the number of human slaves were almost equal. Humans just needed a little time to prepare for a fight. Hearing this, Rachel was deeply moved. For the first time, she felt relieved, realizing she wasn't serving some stupid guy working for the demon army after all. After calming Rachel down, Choi had one last thing to do for the night. Check what rewards he could get after completing his first quest and earning 100 hero points. On the other hand, Rachel, being a newbie fairy or pretending to be one, acted unaware that the system had something called the Hero Store. Without hesitation, Choi decided to try his luck and open the shop, hoping to get something legendary, or at least something worth his effort. Eager to see what kind of reward he'd get after completing his first bizarre quest, Choi was completely shocked to discover he wasn't receiving a legendary item or powerful skill. Far from it. Instead, his reward was a choice between two F-rank talents. One for holding his breath longer, the other for, embarrassingly, holding his poop better. The rest of the available skills weren't much better, either. They included things like laundry, cooking, cleaning, and other mundane household chores. Rachel burst out laughing, making Choi's already sour mood even worse. For once, though, Rachel wasn't lying when she explained that this was only a level 1 store and he'd need to earn more hero points to level it up for better rewards. What Rachel didn't realize was that this wasn't the time to ask Choi to be reasonable. Losing his temper, Choi lunged at her, trying to grab the girl and give her a good slap on the butt just to vent his frustration. Several days, or perhaps weeks, later, slaves were lined up in neat rows in the fortress courtyard, ready to salute the Demon King. Predictably, it was Choi who had organized them. Afterwards, he ordered the slaves to sing another of their songs about defeating and killing humans. Each group of human slaves, divided into groups of 30, began shouting and singing as Choi commanded. A little farther away, Sir Riadrun was watching the scene, feeling relieved that he had let Choi train the slaves. Just then, someone burst into his office in a hurry. A subordinate, probably the same goblin who seemed to favor Choi, rushing in to report something urgent. Without wasting time, the goblin announced that the human army was advancing toward their fortress and had already defeated the 8th Division, which was supposed to confront them. Riadrun, the cow-headed orc, didn't panic. He calmly assessed the situation, knowing the 8th Division was the largest demon army in the area. It didn't take long for him to realize they had no choice but to abandon the fortress and retreat, just as it was nearly completed. The goblin explained that the humans were already very close and warned that Riadrun needed to escape immediately. But Riadrun had something else on his mind. He turned to the window and glanced at Choi. Based on his experience and instincts, Choi seemed like someone who could become valuable in the future. Riadrun wasn't about to abandon him and flee without him. Meanwhile, Choi was busy with his daily training, completely unaware of what was going on, until he heard the loud crash of Riadrun's window shattering. Even then, Choi didn't pay much attention to the noise, focusing instead on checking his status. All the while, Riadrun climbed out of the broken window, ready to act. While Choi was thinking there weren't any sudden events to boost his status, the red cow-headed orc, Riadrun, suddenly jumped and landed right behind him. As expected, Choi was startled and couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Without wasting a second, Riadrun told him to follow immediately. Choi was so shocked he couldn't help but ask why he suddenly needed to go with the red orc boss. Before Riadrun could explain, the human army appeared out of nowhere, and their leader gave the order to attack. Spearmen charged forward while bowmen provided cover, catching the goblins completely off guard. Seeing the sheer number of humans, Riadrun quickly realized they were in no position to fight back. To make matters worse, the human slaves began fleeing the battlefield, desperate to save their own lives. As chaos unfolded, a thought crossed Choi's mind. What if I betray Riadrun right now? What if I backstab him and take the glory of killing one of the Demon King's generals? The idea of earning honor and recognition as a hero was tempting, but before he could act, a human knight suddenly appeared, aiming to kill Riadrun. The sight snapped Choi out of his thoughts. Surprisingly, without even breaking a sweat, Riadrun stopped the knight in his tracks by simply grabbing his head in one swift motion. However, Riadrun didn't just stop the knight. He crushed the man's head, squeezing until it was on the verge of exploding. Choi was completely shocked by the sight, but it wasn't over yet. Riadrun lifted the man's body and smashed him into the ground with such force that it didn't just kill the knight. It cracked the area around the impact and sent several soldiers flying from the shockwave. Turning to Choi, the cow-headed orc asked if he was hurt. Choi was physically unharmed, but the brutal scene left him terrified. It was the moment he realized it was probably best not to get in Riadrun's way. Hours later, after the humans had completely taken over the demon fortress, the soldiers began gathering the human slaves, dividing them into different groups. Along with that, they started separating warriors and self-proclaimed heroes from regular civilians. That's when another man arrived, greeting the warriors, the commander of the human army, Duke Olaven Grimier. Shortly after, a soldier approached and reported that they had successfully evacuated all civilians. The soldier also mentioned that everyone claiming to be a hero or warrior had been drafted. Olaven nodded in approval, thanked the soldier for his work, and reminded him that it was time for the soldiers to do what they were supposed to do. By Duke Olaven's orders, a group of soldiers suddenly drew their swords and surrounded the poor self-proclaimed warriors, catching them off guard and attempting to wipe them out right then and there. Meanwhile, on the other side of demon territory, several carriages were making their way through the forest. Choi was sitting in one of them, regretting his decision to follow Riadrun and join the demon army. He hadn't planned to side with a demon, but after witnessing the way Riadrun killed that knight and blew away the others, he felt like he had no choice. Rachel, however, wasn't upset or angry about Choi abandoning the other humans. Instead, she assumed her warrior was doing all of this as part of some grand plan to get closer to defeating the demon lord, and even thanked Choi for it. Their quiet conversation ended up waking Riadrun, who had only just fallen asleep. The cow-headed orc opened his eyes and asked if Choi had something he wanted to say. Choi's expression shifted immediately, and he quickly pretended he was just mumbling about how honored he felt to be traveling with Riadrun. Hearing this, Riadrun's expression changed as well. He declared how pleased he was to hear such words. To Choi's surprise, the cow-headed orc then announced that he would officially enlist Choi's name in the demon army as soon as they arrived at their destination. The protagonist forced himself to say how much of a huge honor this was, but internally he was panicking and feeling completely the opposite. After a few hours, just as the sun set, they finally arrived at the Third Corps' headquarters. They entered the castle, and Riadrun told Choi to follow him, saying he wanted to take him straight to the commander. Still with tears in his eyes and a sad expression, Choi found himself in no position to refuse Riadrun's request. To make things worse, Riadrun added to Choi's fear by warning him to be extremely careful with his behavior in front of the commander, or else he'd end up dead within the first minute. With no desire to lose his life, Choi reluctantly accepted this as just another challenge he needed to survive. He followed the cow-headed orc down the halls until they reached the commander's room. Riadrun announced his presence and politely asked for permission to enter. After a few seconds of silence, a voice finally responded, granting them permission to come in. It was a woman's voice, which immediately got Choi thinking. Was the terrifying commander Riadrun warned him about a woman, or was it just the voice of a female gatekeeper? All his questions were answered the moment he stepped into the room. Standing before him was the demon commander, a woman with a striking appearance, her watermelons even more memorable than the day he first laid eyes on Rachel's melons. The demon commander acted as if she was reuniting with a long-lost friend, beaming with happiness, making it clear how thrilled she was to see Riadrun again after such a long time. Choi's eyes widened in shock as he wondered if such stunningly beautiful melons of that size could truly exist. To make it even more surprising for him, they were hanging on a commander whom Riadrun clearly respected a great deal. As Riadrun and Commander Hemis exchanged pleasant compliments about each other's muscles and appearance, Choi couldn't help but wonder if he should follow suit and offer some praise about Commander Hemis's beauty. Before he could open his mouth, however, Riadrun stepped forward and apologized for failing to protect the newly built fortress. To Choi's surprise, the demon woman wasn't angry at all. Instead, she shifted the blame onto the commander of the 8th Division, insisting that it was his failure that had caused all this chaos. Laughing, though clearly holding some anger inside, Commander Hemis announced that she should have made a bag out of that loser while she still had the chance. As she spoke, a dark aura began to surround her, enveloping the room and making it hard for Choi to breathe. His hands trembled in fear under the overwhelming pressure, realizing that he had never experienced anything like this before. Hemis, however, didn't seem interested in dragging out the past. Instead, she turned her gaze to Riadrun and demanded to know why he had brought a human all the way into the depths of demon territory. Calm as ever, Riadrun explained that Choi was the one he had already reported he'd be bringing, and without hesitation, he introduced Choi and stated that he wanted to officially enlist him in the demon army. In a flash, Hemis appeared in front of him, calling him cutie. Yet it wasn't just Choi's appearance that caught her attention. She seemed much more interested in his potential, confident that there must be a good reason why Riadrun had personally chosen a human and gone through so much trouble to bring him here. With a concerned look, Hemis reminded Riadrun that with his fragile human body, the boy wouldn't last long in the demon army, something Riadrun was already well aware of. The cow-headed orc explained that he had a plan. He would personally train the boy and requested his commander's permission to start right away. Hemis, however, refused. She told Riadrun that someone of his caliber shouldn't waste time training a weak and ugly human. But it was clear she had something else in mind to help Riadrun's favorite human survive. Out of nowhere, Hemis made a sudden move and began to transform, her head shifting into something else entirely. In mere moments, a strange aura surrounded her, making the air feel even heavier. To Choi's utter disbelief, her head shifted into what looked like a wild, carnivorous plant. He stood there, dumbfounded, jaw practically hitting the floor as he stared at the bizarre transformation. Things only got weirder when Hemis reached into the depths of her plant-like mouth and pulled out a cute, demonic creature, something that looked like a mix between a cat and a dog. As her head returned to its normal shape, she held up the pet and declared that, from now on, Choi would be its new caretaker. The creature's name was Bobo, and as soon as it laid eyes on Choi, its cute face instantly twisted into something resembling a dog eager to devour its next meal. Choi was both amazed and horrified, first by the commander's bizarre head transformation, second by her casually pulling out a living pet, and lastly by being asked to take care of it. His obvious reaction didn't go unnoticed by Commander Hemis. She immediately changed her tone, narrowing her eyes as she asked, "Do you dare not like Bobo?" Realizing he was in a life-or-death situation, Choi didn't hesitate. He straightened up, gave a military-style salute, and declared that it would be a great honor to take care of Bobo. Hemis, clearly satisfied with his response, handed the creature over without another word. As she did, she casually explained a few things about Bobo, like how it goes absolutely feral when hungry, or how it had eaten all its previous caretakers. Meanwhile, Choi stood stiffly, nodding along to her words, too terrified to stop Bobo from gnawing on his head. A few minutes later, the meeting ended and they moved to a room inside the castle, which had a poster of Bobo plastered on the door. It felt like the chaos was only just beginning. In the middle of it all, Choi suddenly received another quest from the system. The timing couldn't have been worse. Even Rachel was caught off guard. The quest was simple: survive by gaining Bobo's affection. The reward? 200 hero points. Choi started thinking deeply about the reward, but something didn't make sense. Glancing at the sleeping Bobo, he couldn't help but wonder how on earth he was supposed to gain the affection of this creature. Just then, the door creaked open and someone walked into the room. As expected, it was an ugly goblin who worked as Bobo's caretaker. The moment he entered, Choi quickly introduced himself and greeted the goblin respectfully, all the while sizing him up and unable to shake the feeling that this creature saw him as nothing more than a walking human snack. Trying to keep his cool, Choi asked if there were any senior caretakers he should know about. The goblin simply repeated Commander Hemis's words, stating that he was the only one left, because Bobo had eaten all the others. With nothing else to discuss, the goblin got straight to the point, telling Choi he'd need to help prepare Bobo's meals from now on. In an almost bossy tone, he urged Choi to start work immediately. But before Choi could respond, chaos erupted. The goblin's loud voice had woken Bobo, and in an instant, the creature appeared on top of the goblin, licking the goblin's ugly head like it was a piece of candy. Panicked, he dashed behind Choi, hoping to get sheltered, trembling with fear and desperate to save his own life. He started offering Choi as food to distract Bobo and save himself for just one more day. It was clear the goblin was terrified to his very core, but his cowardice left Choi in an awkward and dangerous position. Choi wasn't the type to let a tiny goblin force him into sacrificing his life. Without hesitation, he grabbed the goblin's belt and hurled him away with all his strength. On the other side, Bobo was prepared for this moment, eagerly awaiting his snack. Despite its size, it didn't take long for Bobo to finish eating the goblin in less than a few minutes. The way Bobo tore apart and devoured the goblin made both Choi and Rachel realize one thing: this dog really loved goblin meat. After feeding Bobo, a new problem popped up, and Bobo now wanted a playmate. Unfortunately, Rachel was the only one who could meet its expectations. Poor Rachel wasn't thrilled about playing with Bobo, mainly because she could get killed at any moment. She frantically begged for help, but Choi just ignored her. Worse, he even told her not to run too much, or it might make Bobo hungry again. Choi actually had a reason for ignoring Rachel. He was busy searching for something in the hero store. It didn't take him long to find it: an extra-large bone designed to attract any monster's attention. He bought on the spot and jumped into action. Calling Bobo's name was enough to grab the creature's attention. Holding up the bone, Choi changed his tone and asked if Bobo wanted it. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed the bone into the air, Just as he expected, Bobo's eyes locked onto it faster than any dog's, and Bobo leapt up, catching the bone in midair. After being forced to fly around for a while, Rachel finally managed to take a short break, panting and unable to believe she was saved. She wondered how Choi had found such an attractive bone in the hero store. Feeling proud of himself, Choi began bragging about how much of a genius he was and how it wouldn't take him long to complete any quest. Little did he know, Bobo was already coming for him. Luckily, Bobo missed his target, but that was the moment Choi froze in shock, realizing things weren't going to be as easy as he thought. It turned out Bobo had already devoured the large bone and, with the boy's collar clenched between its teeth, made it very clear that one bone wasn't enough. Staring at Bobo, Choi quickly realized the dog needed more fresh food, preferably something besides his own flesh. That's when Rachel suggested they take Bobo outside to find something more suitable to eat. Her words gave Choi an idea to save himself from being Bobo's next meal. Thinking hard, he tried to come up with a magical word that could calm any pet. Suddenly, inspiration struck, and he shouted, "Walk!" In an unexpected twist, Bobo's entire demeanor changed. It was like the dog-like creature had two completely different personalities. Instantly, it turned into a playful house pet, excited and full of energy, acting like a puppy eager for a walk. Bobo jumped straight into Choi's arms, and minutes later, Choi found himself running around the castle like Batman, chasing after Bobo, desperately searching for a kitchen to find something edible for the dog. Rachel, meanwhile, was also looking for a place where they could find food for Bobo, but couldn't find a trace. That's when she spotted a goblin running away and immediately told Choi to stop him, not to feed him to Bobo, but to ask where the castle's kitchen was. Choi did as Rachel suggested, but the goblin wasn't thrilled about being stopped by a human. Before the situation could escalate, Bobo stepped in, acting as if he wanted food right now. Of course, this scared the life out of the goblin, who immediately thought he was next on the menu. In the blink of an eye, the goblin found himself cornered with no chance of escape as Bobo started preparing to devour him. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Choi stepped in and stopped Bobo, announcing that he was Bobo's new caretaker and that they were just looking for the kitchen to feed him. The goblin didn't waste a second and used the opportunity to flee, but just before disappearing, he quickly told them to go left to reach the kitchen. The goblin's terrified reaction at first left Choi and Rachel stunned, but it didn't take long before they burst into laughter. They couldn't help but wonder why a goblin in the demon army would act so pathetic against a pet. Laughing and having fun after such a long time was something Choi had been craving, but just as he was busy cracking jokes, he suddenly realized something. Bobo was gone and nowhere to be found. Panic set in as he thought about what would happen if Commander Hemis found out he had lost her beloved pet. Without wasting another second, Choi immediately began searching the castle frantically, determined to find the dog-like creature before being summoned by Commander Hemis. He and Rachel combed every corridor, desperately scanning for any trace of Bobo. With tears stinging his eyes, Choi couldn't help but think that just a single minute was enough for Bobo to cause a catastrophe. He was certain he'd be the one to face the consequences for whatever Bobo did. Rachel was just as frantic, her eyes darting around corners and under tables as she called out for the demon dog. Just then, Rachel caught sight of something moving toward them. It was Bobo. However, her relief was short-lived. Bobo's mouth and fur were smeared with fresh blood. Seeing the creature brought Choi a brief moment of relief, making him think that perhaps he was safe now. But the moment Bobo sat obediently in front of him, loud shouting and screaming erupted down the corridor. It became clear that Bobo had already found trouble, serious trouble. From the commotion, it sounded as if Bobo had killed someone important, possibly even eaten him, in the short time he'd been missing. Choi and Rachel stood frozen, completely stunned. Choi's worst fears were confirmed. This was exactly the disaster he'd been dreading. Out of nowhere, a mob of furious goblins appeared, all of them desperate to catch the culprit who had killed their captain. They charged at Choi and Rachel, assuming the human was responsible for the carnage. Choi, thinking quickly, scooped Bobo up and bolted, Rachel hot on his heels. Unfortunately, the castle's twisting corridors soon led them to a dead end, and they found themselves cornered. The goblins, unaware that Bobo was the true culprit, believed Choi had murdered their captain. As flesh-hungry monsters who would eat even their own kind, each goblin began to imagine how they would divide up Choi's body after killing him. Frantically, Choi searched for a way to save himself, his mind racing. Finally, an idea struck him, and he shouted, How dare you? But then he realized the situation was even graver than he'd thought. It wasn't just a handful of goblins, but an entire army blocking the hall. Even so, he didn't hesitate. Pointing at Bobo, he shouted again, asking how they didn't recognize the commander's pet. None of the goblins seemed to have ever seen Bobo before. One of them hesitantly muttered, "Isn't it just a monster?" In response, Choi glared at the goblin and declared in a furious voice, "You shouldn't dare call Bobo a monster." He brought Bobo forward and loudly announced the demon dog's name. At the mention of Bobo, some of the goblins seemed to recognize it, though its current blood-soaked appearance didn't match their memory. They started to wonder if this could really be the same Bobo as Commander Hemis's legendary pet, or if Choi was simply trying to bluff his way out of trouble. Expecting their skepticism, Choi put Bobo down, ready to prove the creature's identity. In an instant, Bobo's beast mode switched on. Whether by Choi's silent command or its own animal instincts, Bobo lunged at the goblin who had doubted it was the real Bobo. Choi didn't interfere. He watched as Bobo tore into the unlucky goblin, and within a minute, nothing remained but a skeleton. Taking advantage of the stunned silence, Choi asked, "Does anyone else have something to say about Bobo?" Not a single goblin dared to speak up. Instead, they all bowed and showed their respect. In that moment, Choi felt a strange rush of confidence. His hidden attribute, charisma, increased as he managed to subdue an enraged group of goblins without lifting a finger. Just then, someone else entered the scene, drawn by the uproar. It was Commander Hemis herself, her presence catching Choi completely off guard. Fortunately, he had already managed to settle the situation. Soon after, they were summoned back to Commander Hemis's office. The demon woman looked at Choi and asked directly if he had really used her name and Bobo to survive. Fully aware of the gravity of the situation, Choi dropped to his knees before Hemis, confessing and apologizing for what he called his grave sin. To his surprise, the commander didn't do this to blame him. She was actually complimenting him for his quick thinking and cleverness. A short time later, Hemis approached and gently touched Choi's face, admiring him for not being as foolish as other demons. She even remarked on how much she liked his guts and the way he acted without fear. Returning to her seat, Hemis explained why she had taken such an interest in him. She noticed he was different from most demons, who acted purely on brute force without thinking and ultimately caused a lot of trouble. Choi couldn't fully understand what she meant about demons causing trouble, so he asked for more details. Hemis told him to wait, saying she believed he would figure it out soon enough. Then, out of nowhere, Commander Hemis asked Choi if he had ever considered becoming her exclusive subordinate. Choi was completely bewildered. He couldn't believe the commander was even entertaining the idea of making him her exclusive, especially given his current skills and level. However, Hemis quickly clarified that she didn't mean to make him her exclusive right away. She explained that doing so wouldn't be good for her reputation within the demon army. Instead, she revealed the existence of a decisive battle system among the demons, a system that allowed anyone to challenge their superior and claim their rank if they won. To help Choi improve, Hemis offered to put him under her protection for 1 month. After that, he would have to fight against opponents of her choosing. By accepting her offer, Choi could extend her protection month by month, as long as he continued to defeat each opponent she selected for him. Hemis had clearly planned all of this with a purpose, to help him slowly climb the ladder of advancement, with the hope that he would eventually become a battalion commander like Riadrun and prove himself useful. Still, Choi couldn't help but wonder what would happen if he lost a match. Sensing his anxiety, Hemis revealed a glimpse of her more frightening, cannibalistic form and responded coldly, warning him not to expect anything less than a painful death should he fail. Moments later, Choi found himself standing outside the commander's office, but already, regret was beginning to gnaw at him. To make matters worse, Hemis had chosen an opponent for him right on the spot, someone so formidable that Rachel immediately assumed she'd have to say farewell to him forever after the next month. Desperate for some inspiration or comfort, Choi turned to Rachel and asked if she remembered the day she called him an SSS rank hero. Rachel nodded, but then began to explain what she had truly meant by those words. It wasn't a guarantee. She had been referring to his potential, and it was something that could happen, but was by no means certainty. Choi had been hoping for encouragement, but instead, Rachel's words left him feeling even more disappointed and deflated. As anxiety began to creep in again, Choi suddenly found himself standing in front of a massive, iron-bound door, its surface covered in dried blood. He immediately realized it must be the castle's kitchen and decided to check it out, hoping to finally find something for Bobo to eat. As soon as he opened the door, he was met by a hulking figure, a massive orc, ogre, or perhaps a big red goblin. The creature introduced himself as Culkin, the chef of the demon army, and asked if Choi was the human the commander had mentioned to him. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Choi hesitantly asked if there was any chance he could get a snack for Bobo. To his dismay, Chef Culkin flatly refused, showing no interest in helping the boy. The only order he'd received from Commander Hemis was not to harm the human in the castle. Beyond that, Culkin clearly didn't care. Choi realized he wouldn't last long if he didn't find something for Bobo. So he persisted, continuing to beg for help. Seeing how desperate the boy was, Culkin finally shot him a sidelong glance, gesturing for Choi to go get the food himself. Choi looked in the direction Culkin had indicated and saw a group of goblins a little further behind the chef, busy butchering some green monster. They laughed and celebrated as they chopped it into pieces, apparently throwing a party to celebrate the death of one of their own comrades by turning him into a meal. Watching their disturbing behavior and grotesque appearance, Choi couldn't help but wonder if all these goblins were butchers or cooks. Now, stuck between the goblins' macabre meat party and the towering, intimidating Chef Culkin, Choi wondered how on earth he was supposed to get a snack for Bobo, and more importantly, if he could do it without getting eaten himself. Without any warning, the scene shifted to a forest, where Choi found himself face to face with a giant wild boar. He wasn't alone. He'd been forced to tag along with a group of goblins to hunt something for dinner and, of course, for Bobo. Luckily, before the boar could reach him, its attention shifted to another goblin, and with one swift strike, the boar killed it. The goblin's lifeless body was tossed in front of Choi, who couldn't help but wonder who would end up as dinner, the goblins or the boar. Rachel suggested they should run to avoid ending up like that poor goblin, but with so many eyes on them, Choi thought it was impossible. Still, he knew Rachel was right. Their lives were in serious danger, and he figured the best plan was to hide for now. Unfortunately, just as he was thinking this, someone summoned him. Choi stood up and nervously announced that he was ready to risk his life for dinner. It turned out to be Chef Culkin who had called him. However, Culkin quickly said Choi didn't need to fight the boar after all, as the boar, already outnumbered, had been killed and the hunt was over. Choi was shocked. He hadn't expected the goblins to actually succeed after watching them charge in so recklessly. A little while later, a scruffy, ugly goblin entered the scene to give a report on the hunt's outcome. According to him, 12 goblins had been killed and many more were injured because of that wild boar. Choi was shocked to realize the goblin army had taken way more damage than he initially thought. But unlike him, Chef Culkin seemed pleased with the outcome, giving a thumbs up. Culkin casually told the goblins to start searching for their next prey after a short break. Before long, Choi found himself standing alone, deep in thought. Hiding and running away didn't seem like an option anymore. Hearing this, Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. She asked if Choi was seriously considering joining the goblins for their next hunt. Choi shook his head and explained that what he really needed was to level up his stats, and for that he needed experience. Then he shared an idea that left Rachel speechless. He wondered if he could still earn experience points by delivering the final blow to kill a monster. Rachel hesitated but confirmed that it would work. However, she wasn't a fan of the plan, calling it a sloppy and underhanded move. Choi didn't care, ignoring Rachel's opinion. He simply turned around and started walking. He knew he had to get much stronger in a month, and as a weak human, this was the only way he could do it. After some searching, he finally found Chef Culkin. Before Choi could say a word, the chef smirked and said, "I thought you ran away." Choi quickly replied that he'd never do such a thing, but in his head, he wondered if the goblin chef could somehow read minds. Without wasting any time, he asked Chef Culkin for permission to join the next hunt. The red orc looked surprised, glancing at Choi with a terrifying expression that made him break out in a cold sweat. For a moment, he wondered if he had crossed the line, but suddenly Chef Culkin burst into loud laughter, declaring that he liked Choi's boldness. With an awkward smile, Choi thanked the chef for his kind words, but his confidence immediately vanished when Culkin added that Choi would have to lead the next hunt. Culkin gave him a thumbs up and explained that they had a lot of respect for those who took charge, even if it was just for a short time. Then, to Choi's shock, Culkin said it was the first time he'd ever let a newcomer, especially a human, take the lead. Panicking, Choi tried to come up with an excuse to decline. He stammered something about how others might complain or even cause chaos if he became the leader. But before Culkin could respond, a goblin came sprinting toward them, shouting the chef's name from a distance. The urgency in the goblin's voice made Chef Culkin frown, wondering if something serious had happened. As the goblin ran as fast as his little legs could carry him, he yelled, "Monster invasion!" But the warning was hardly necessary, as the deafening cries of the Arun herd were already echoing through the forest, announcing their arrival loud and clear. Unfamiliar with Arun monsters, the terrified protagonist nervously asked Chef Culkin if their lives were in danger. To his surprise, the chef didn't seem concerned at all. In fact, Culkin didn't like the invasion for a completely unexpected reason. He thought Arun meat wasn't tasty. Still, he wasn't about to pass up food that was practically delivering itself to them. Pulling out his massive cleaver, Culkin ordered everyone else to do the same. Not to defend themselves, but to prepare for adding Arun meat stew to the night's menu. Choi was both shocked and relieved at the same time. If this was how they handled invasions, it meant the only thing he needed to do was stick close and steal some kills. To help her master, Rachel decided to use one of her skills to slightly boost his strength and health. However, the effect wouldn't last long. It would disappear after just 3 minutes. Choi was amazed as he suddenly felt lighter and stronger, like his body had been supercharged. Expecting some gratitude for her effort, Rachel was instead met with a punch on the head. "Why didn't you use this earlier?" Choi scolded her, completely ignoring her good intentions. With his newfound strength and a burning desire to rack up as many last hits as possible, Choi bolted toward the battlefield. For motivation, he painted a vivid picture in his mind. A future where a blonde, noble girl waited for him, along with 5 kids who depended on him to grow stronger and protect them. This ridiculous but oddly inspiring thought gave him enough energy to leap into action like an overexcited grasshopper, hoping to score his first kill. It didn't take long for Choi to score his first last hit, taking down his first Arun, a creature that looked a lot like a wolf. As soon as the monster fell, he leveled up 4 times in one go, something he never imagined would happen. Overwhelmed with excitement, Choi started dreaming big, setting his sights on reaching level 20 by the end of the day. As time passed, the battle became more brutal. Many goblins lost their lives in the fight, but they managed to take down the swarm of Arun. Just as one injured goblin staggered forward to finish off the last Arun, Choi suddenly appeared out of nowhere. He shoved the goblin aside with a heavy elbow strike, mumbling an insincere apology about slipping. With a crazed grin that made him look possessed, Choi shouted, "Every last hit in the world is mine, and mine alone." After some time, Choi found himself standing apart from the group of goblins, watching them butcher and pack up the meat from the boars and Arun. Rachel appeared next to him, her expression somewhere between tired and completely bored. "Is the hunting finally over, or are we still going?" she asked flatly. Choi smirked and called her his buff bot, replying that every monster in the area had already been killed and the goblins were almost done packing up the meat. But then his smirk quickly disappeared as he noticed some of the goblins sneaking bites of the meat they were supposed to bring back as supplies for their army. Choi was completely clueless about what was happening. That's when Chef Culkin gently placed a hand on his shoulder, snapping the boy out of his daze and asking why he'd been staring for so long. Taken by surprise, Choi blurted out, "Wait, are goblin soldiers really allowed to eat the army's food like that?" Unlike the stunned boy, Culkin remained calm as he explained, "It's one of the privileges of being cooks and hunters. They get to enjoy fresh meat as a reward for their hard work. Honestly, it's the only reason they're willing to risk their necks in these deadly hunts." The explanation didn't sit well with Choi. It made no sense to him. He couldn't imagine putting his life on the line just for a chance to eat fresh food. To him, it wasn't worth the danger, no matter how good the food might be. On the other hand, Chef Culkin seemed impressed with Choi's efforts. Smiling, he praised Choi's hard work as a warrior and offered him a piece of his own food as a sign of respect. Choi stared at the chunk of meat in front of him, already bitten into, and hesitated. Could this really taste as good as Culkin claimed? After some internal debate, he decided to give it a shot. Taking a cautious bite, the first thing he noticed was that the meat wasn't bad at all, but at the same time, it wasn't anything special either. It felt oddly chewy and surprisingly bland, leaving him a little underwhelmed. Watching the goblins celebrate so enthusiastically made Choi question why they would risk their lives for such mediocre, sloppy meat. It was baffling. Then, in a flash, a wild idea struck him, making him shout, "What if I can make a dish way better than this?" He didn't mean to shout, but the thought consumed him. If he could create something truly delicious, he was sure he could win everyone's favor and maybe even control them if his plan worked. Without waiting for Rachel's opinion, he opened the hero's store, raising his hand like a crazed rock star. He remembered he only had 70 hero points left and would need to spend them wisely to achieve his goal. He already knew what he needed and didn't hesitate. His hand began glowing as Rachel looked on, confused. It became clear soon enough. He spent 20 hero points on seasonings, including salt, and the remaining 50 on an F-rank cooking skill that would improve his culinary abilities. Rachel could only wonder what Choi was up to without saying a word. But soon, the fairy girl fumed, yelling at Choi because she thought he was just wasting his precious hero points on useless items. Choi, on the other hand, realized it was pointless to argue with Rachel, so instead, he decided to show her what he was planning. He slowly turned the meat over the fire and carefully sprinkled salt on it, acting as if he had been a world-famous chef his whole life. He treated the simple act of seasoning the meat like it was the most important thing in the world. To Choi, that piece of meat was glowing, and he was convinced it had become much more delicious than before. Brimming with confidence, he couldn't help but wonder if he was going to become a legendary boss in this strange new world simply by cooking such delicious food. Then, in a sudden move, Choi, instead of eating the meat himself, offered it to Chef Culkin. However, Culkin, who was already full, politely declined. But Choi wasn't about to give up. He bowed deeply and begged the chef to at least take one small bite as a test, determined to make his dream come true. Choi was willing to do whatever it took to get Chef Culkin to try the meat. Finally, tired of Choi's persistence, Culkin gave in and took a bite just to get him to stop. The moment the meat touched his tongue, Culkin was overwhelmed with nostalgia. It was as if he had been transported back in time to his childhood. The days when his mother lovingly cooked meat for dinner, or the times when his father took him to visit a renowned chef for a special meal. Those sweet memories of his wonderful childhood with his family played vividly in his mind. Before he even realized it, he was back in his adult self again, but all those warm memories made the chef tear up like a little kid, realizing just how much he missed his beloved mother. Several hours later, when they returned to the castle, Culkin handed Choi a full bag of snacks for Bobo as a token of gratitude for giving him the most delicious food he'd ever tasted, just like his mother used to make. Not long after, Choi arrived at Bobo's house. He playfully swung the door open and called out for Bobo, but before he could even tell the demon dog that he brought snacks, Bobo surprised him with a sudden pounce. Thankfully, Choi had already prepared for emergencies like this. Instead of letting himself get caught, he quickly shoved a snack into Bobo's mouth. Bobo's aggressive, hungry demeanor immediately shifted to a happy and grateful one, his tail wagging furiously as he chewed on the treat, clearly enjoying every bite after waiting so long. Seeing how hungry Bobo was, Choi decided to hand over everything he had brought from the kitchen. With a grin, he declared that Bobo could eat all of it because he'd make sure to get even more snacks tomorrow. The puppy didn't expect to get so much of its favorite food and was completely amazed. Not knowing how to show its appreciation, since it couldn't talk like most pets, it simply stared up at Choi with wide, sparkling eyes. That was the moment Bobo's affinity increased enough to meet the requirements for the quest. Choi's second task was now complete, and he earned 200 more hero points just like that. The boy had expected this outcome, and seeing his efforts pay off so quickly made him feel pretty satisfied. Rachel, on the other hand, was watching him with a mix of awe and curiosity, wondering what Choi would do next now that he was making progress with the quest. Feeling more confident than ever, Choi opened his status screen to check everything. That's when he noticed something surprising. Along with his hero points, he had a stash of bonus points he hadn't used yet. The problem was he had no idea what they were or how he was supposed to use them, all because he had skipped the tutorial on the very first day. Rachel, noticing his confusion, tried to explain how the bonus points worked. The protagonist, half joking but also annoyed, blamed Rachel for not telling him something this important sooner. Of course, the fairy girl reluctantly accepted the blame and quickly tried to make up for her earlier mistake. To make things right, Rachel began explaining everything she should have told him on the first day. According to her, those bonus points could be used to increase 4 basic stats: strength, stamina, agility, and mana. Each of these stats was unique and useful in its own way, depending on what Choi wanted to focus on. Choi remembered he had increased something else called charisma, so he asked Rachel if it was similar to his basic stats. The fairy girl explained that charisma is a hidden stat and can only be leveled up through specific training, not by using bonus points. She then advised her master to distribute his bonus points equally across all the stats. However, Choi was seriously considering dumping all of them into his strength stat. In Rachel's opinion, that was the worst idea ever. She warned him that if he did that, he'd definitely regret it later. To make her point clearer, she explained that Choi would eventually be able to enhance his body with mana, which would make him much stronger than someone who had invested everything into just strength. Surprisingly, Rachel's advice actually seemed to sink in for the first time, and Choi decided to follow her suggestion. He spread his bonus points evenly across all the stats and confirmed the changes. Once that was done, Rachel mentioned that he could now buy the fundamentals of mana control from the hero shop, which would help him in the future. Clueless about what mana control even was, Choi decided to trust Rachel's advice, since she clearly knew more about this world than he did. He searched the hero shop for a while, but no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find anything resembling what Rachel had described. Poor Rachel was completely embarrassed. She had been so confident, acting like this item definitely existed, but turned out there was no such thing. Choi immediately regretted trusting her again and started teasing her, accusing her of lying and tricking him for no reason. 3 weeks flew by, and Choi was lying flat on the ground, completely exhausted after non-stop training to reach level 100. Checking his status, Choi couldn't help but wonder if any hero in this world was working as hard as he was. However, Rachel quickly shattered his sense of pride, casually calling him a cure. That one word was enough to get on Choi's nerves. Furious, he grabbed Rachel and slammed her onto the ground multiple times, taking full advantage of her small size. While being wildly tossed around, the fairy girl frantically explained that she wasn't trying to insult him. She clarified that what she meant was that most ordinary heroes take at least 6 months to reach level 100, while it only took him 3 weeks. Now looking like a squashed yellow blob on the ground, poor Rachel weakly added that she hadn't meant to offend him by calling him a cure. She was just trying to be friendly. In the middle of their argument, the door suddenly opened and a goblin entered Bobo's house. The goblin announced that Commander Hemis had sent him to immediately bring Choi to her office. A few minutes later, Choi arrived at the commander's office. As usual, Hemis was lounging casually in her chair, greeting him with a warm welcome. With just a single glance, she instantly noticed how much stronger Choi had gotten since the last time they met. Even his mana had nearly doubled, and her sharp eyes didn't miss it. Showing respect and gratitude, Choi thanked Commander Hemis and then mentioned that he had been feeding Bobo the best meat and snacks every day, as she ordered. However, the commander didn't seem to care much about Bobo at the moment. Her mind was entirely preoccupied with how quickly Choi was getting stronger, or at least pretending to be. Out of nowhere, she asked him, "Is this because of the level system for heroes?" The sudden question shocked Choi the most. He froze, unable to hide his confusion, and couldn't help but wonder, does the commander actually know I was supposed to be a hero? Seeing how surprised he looked, Hemis tried to calm him down, casually explaining that she had known the truth from the very first day they met. With a shaky voice, Choi finally got the courage to ask how she had figured that out, but Hemis didn't answer. Instead, she ignored his question entirely and redirected the conversation, asking him to think about why she had summoned him in the first place. Trembling slightly, Choi started blurting out nonsense, throwing out random guesses like, for Bobo's training? Or maybe kill stealing? Or something naughty? After rambling for a while, it finally hit him. He had been called here because of the promise of a battle in a month. Realizing this, Choi relaxed a little. Since he had been training so hard and believed he had done his absolute best, he grew confident, assuming he was about to be praised again for his efforts. At first, Commander Hemis acted like she was about to praise his hard work, but in a split second, she showed her true colors and started yelling at Choi, saying his progress in leveling up wasn't as fast as she'd expected. Hemis, with her carnivorous plant appearance, declared that she expected him to grow much more as a hero, and that was the only reason she allowed him to stay in the demon army. As a final warning, she ordered Choi to work much harder if he wanted to stay alive. Choi was both shocked and scared, but what shook him even more was hearing that Hemis only wanted to make him stronger for her own entertainment, at least for now. Shortly after receiving her warning, Choi left her room and found a quiet spot to reflect on his grim situation. He was convinced that Hemis was just using him as a pawn in some crazy plot twist to grab the attention of her audience, and, of course, for her own amusement. What really bothered him was the fact that he'd already seen this coming, yet there was no way for him to escape it. To make things worse, Rachel was only adding to his frustration by panicking and constantly getting on his nerves. All of a sudden, Choi made a decision to increase his chances of success and also to quickly learn more about his opponent before the battle. He started searching for an item in the hero's store that could help him. Rachel, still in full panic mode, reminded Choi that they only knew the name of his opponent, not what they looked like, so buying an item for this situation would be pointless. As usual, Choi ignored Rachel's concerns, as he had already spotted an item that seemed perfect for the situation. Without even waiting for Rachel to finish talking, he bought it. The item looked like a pair of stylish glasses and was called the Combat Power Meter. With this, Choi could easily measure anyone's stats. Rachel's panicked expression quickly turned into one of surprise. She acted like it was the first time she'd seen an item like this, and to be fair, actually was. Choi then tried to explain how he planned to use it, but only in bits and pieces, as he was too excited to focus on trying it first. Sarcastically, Choi declared that this item would be way more useful to him than Rachel ever was. Meanwhile, to test it out, he decided to use it on Rachel first. The moment he looked at her through the glasses, the item displayed a battle power of 375. However, neither of them had any idea if that number was high or low. Hoping to get some context, they decided Rachel should use the item to measure Choi's battle power as well. The glasses looked ridiculously oversized compared to Rachel's tiny frame, so Choi had to help her hold them up. For a moment, Rachel took a good look at Choi through the lenses but stayed quiet for a while. Choi, growing impatient, expected her to announce some numbers about his power, but when Rachel didn't say anything, he started wondering if maybe he was the only one who could use this item. Finally, Rachel broke her silence. She admitted she could see the numbers, but immediately declared that the item must be broken or something like that. Rachel tried to act surprised, but deep down she was utterly disappointed. Seeing that Choi was nearly 5 times stronger than she was proved to be a hard pill to swallow. Making a huge fuss about it, she dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the realization hit her. The realization that she, as a powerful and high-ranking angel, had turned into someone much weaker than a human in just a month. Meanwhile, Choi paid little attention to Rachel's meltdown. Instead, he focused on testing the item to make sure it worked properly. Curious, he decided to try it out on Bobo. What he saw next left him stunned. Bobo's strength was over 47,000. It suddenly made sense why everyone in the demon army was so terrified of Commander Hemis's pet. For Rachel, this revelation was even worse. The fact that a demonic pet was almost 120 times stronger than her shattered what little pride she had left. After a while, Rachel finally calmed down, and they decided to take a walk around the area, curious to see just how strong the rest of the demon army really was. Choi had already guessed that the goblin soldiers were probably the weakest among the demons, and sure enough, according to the item, every other demon had a strength level similar to his own. Just then, a high orc walked past them. Choi quickly checked its battle power and was shocked to see it was over 14,000. That's when it hit him. Any demon with a battle power above 10,000 was at least at the battalion commander level. After wandering aimlessly for a while, Choi asked Rachel if she remembered anything about the opponent Commander Hemis had mentioned he'd need to fight in a few days. Unlike him, Rachel had all the details. Apparently, his opponent was a platoon leader named Kirkin, with a brain supposedly dumber than a pig's. Choi felt a little more hopeful. He thought that if he trained a bit more, maybe he'd have a shot at beating a platoon leader. Surely Kirkin couldn't have more than 3,000 battle strength, right? But just then, Kirkin himself started causing a scene only a few meters away, yelling his own name and acting like he truly had no brain. Out of curiosity, Choi quickly checked his power level, and, to his horror, it was over 6,000. His jaw practically hit the ground, and his eyes went wide with shock. It felt like a death sentence to even think about fighting that monster. Right at that moment, the god system appeared out of thin air, confirming his fears but also giving him a quest. The quest was simple. He needed to raise his battle power to 3,000 within a week. Completing it would increase his chances of survival, and he'd also earn 300 hero points. The timing of the quest was perfect, snapping Choi out of his panic and giving him a reason to focus and get stronger. After all, in a week he'd have only 2 choices, win or die. But of course, Choi wasn't planning on dying anytime soon. Not before losing his virginity, at least. Without further explanation, the scene shifted to the next morning, where Choi was called to the kitchen and quickly showed up to find out why Culkin wanted to see him. Before saying a word, Chef Culkin noticed the boy's glasses and asked about them. Being a skilled liar, Choi casually replied that he had seen many others wearing the same thing and decided to get a pair for himself. Culkin seemed to believe him and moved on, telling Choi to get ready for a big hunt that day. Before preparing, Choi secretly measured Chef Culkin's battle strength, only to discover that he was far stronger than anyone Choi had ever seen, except for Bobo. Curious, Choi checked the power levels of the other cooks in the kitchen. As he expected, most of them were stronger than him. Suddenly, an idea popped into his head. If he sparred with one of the cooks who had a similar skill level to his upcoming opponent Kirkin, he could learn more about how to fight him. Without hesitation, Choi rushed over to Chef Culkin, bowed his head awkwardly, and politely asked if he could spar with one of the cooks. Culkin was caught off guard by the sudden request, but immediately rejected it. However, Choi, being as persistent as ever, refused to give up, explaining that he wanted to get tougher and stronger through sparring. Chef Culkin dismissed the idea as a pointless hassle, but the boy wasn't ready to back down. As a last resort, he played his final card, threatening that he wouldn't give Culkin a single bite of the meat he'd cook after the next hunt if he refused. That was the tipping point. Reluctantly, Chef Culkin gave in and agreed to the sparring match. A short time later, as everyone gathered and wondered why they'd been called so early, word spread quickly about a sparring match between Choi and someone named Galbasum. Some of the goblins who had tasted Choi's cooking already liked him and wished him good luck, while others whispered about whether today might be the day Choi met his end. Not far away, Choi stood face to face with Galbasum, a massive orc at least twice his size, with a battle strength of over 2,600. Surprisingly, behind them, some goblins were plotting to kill Galbasum before the fight to save Choi, but Chef Culkin quickly stopped them, having a different plan in mind. Soon, the chef approached Galbasum and leaned in close, whispering a single instruction: "Don't kill Choi, no matter what." The orc seemed completely brainless, stupidly repeating Culkin's words verbatim. At that moment, the chef realized his plan to use reasoning might not work with his pig-brained orc, but there wasn't much else he could do right now. Choi and Galbasum moved to the center of the area, while Chef Culkin positioned himself between them, acting as referee for the spar. Both fighters locked eyes. Choi looked determined to win, while Galbasum kept muttering to himself, "Don't kill Choi, don't kill Choi." With that, Chef Culkin announced the start of the sparring match. Choi was the first to make a move, dashing straight toward the massive orc. However, Galbasum struck first, swinging a huge punch at Choi. Fortunately, Choi proved to be more agile. He swiftly dodged the punch and spotted an opening for a counterattack. At first, it looked like Choi was aiming to land a kick on the orc's lower body, but as an experienced MMA fighter, he was only pretending to target that spot. In a sudden, fluid motion, Choi shifted his aim and delivered a powerful kick straight to Galbasum's head. To everyone's shock, and even to Choi's own surprise, that single kick was enough to knock the towering orc flat on the ground. This easy victory made Choi think that, despite the difference in their power levels, maybe he'd really have a chance to win against his crazy opponent, Kirkin. With the sparring finally settled, the focus shifted to the northern part of the dark forest, where the demons had gathered for the hunt. Choi was still riding the high of his victory, overwhelmed by the incredible feeling of winning his battle. He started to believe that all those fancy battle strength numbers were just that, numbers, and nothing was set in stone. Suddenly, an ugly goblin appeared out of nowhere and reported that a large number of Talas were heading in their direction. Chef Culkin's expression darkened immediately, making it clear he didn't like the sound of this news. Unfamiliar with what Talas were, Choi assumed Culkin didn't want to deal with them simply because their meat probably wasn't tasty. But that wasn't the reason at all. As someone with plenty of experience, Culkin explained that their meat, and especially the marrow from their bones, was actually a delicacy. The problem, however, was much bigger than that. Talas were spider-like creatures with skull-shaped bodies, and they lived in large groups. If you killed even one of them, the rest would come swarming for revenge, causing a huge amount of trouble for everyone. Chef Culkin was deep in thought, trying to figure out what they should do next, while Choi secretly hoped they'd just cancel the hunt and head back to the castle right away. However, the thought of how delicious Tala's meat was convinced Culkin to take the risk. He gave the order for everyone to prepare for a tough battle. Not long after, the hunt, or more accurately, the battle, began. At first, the goblins outnumbered the Talas and started to hunt them down one by one as usual. Choi showed up at the last second before killing one prey, pretending it was just a coincidence, and stole the kill with a final blow. The boy knew he needed to use this opportunity to level up as much as possible, and so he did. In less than an hour, they had slaughtered every single Talas in the area and piled their corpses in a random spot. Only one was left, and Choi made it his personal mission to finish it off. Laughing and enjoying the hunt more than anyone else, he felt proud of himself for managing to steal so many kills and level up significantly. He realized he kind of enjoyed butchering wild creatures like these, which was probably why he liked working in the kitchen so much. But his happy moment didn't last long. A sudden shout from the goblins disrupted everything. They were yelling that the Queen of the Talas was here, urging everyone to prepare for the main battle. The enormous queen stood in the distance, completely still, her rage building with every passing second as she stared at the scene of her precious children brutally slaughtered for no reason. Just as the queen seemed on the verge of losing control, Choi decided to use his glasses to check how powerful she really was. To his shock, the glasses couldn't measure the queen's battle strength at all. That's when the queen let out an ear-piercing scream, shaking the entire area. In that instant, Choi realized they were completely doomed. He instinctively turned to check what Chef Culkin, their captain, wanted them to do, but when he looked back, he saw Culkin abandoning everyone, running as fast as he could in the opposite direction. Culkin only bothered to shout over his shoulder at his underlings, telling them to do whatever they could to survive. Choi hadn't expected Chef Culkin to be so irresponsible, but before he could dwell on it, something else took his focus. The panic cries of goblins scattering desperately behind him, trying to escape the Queen of the Talas. Just as the goblins had mercilessly hunted her children, the queen was now pursuing them, her eyes blazing with anger and rage. Her every movement radiated fury, and once again, she let out a deafening scream. A scream so loud it could probably be heard for miles. Choi Hyunseok clutched his ears in desperation, wondering what kind of spider could make a sound like that. At that moment, Rachel urged him to take a quick look behind him. That's when he realized that everyone else had already taken off, running for their lives, and he was the only one still frozen in place. The Queen of the Talas, accompanied by an army of her children, was now just a few meters away, ready to catch him and likely tear him apart. Thanks to Rachel, Choi finally snapped to his senses and realized that he needed to escape as quickly as possible. He started running like mad, fast enough to overtake all the goblins. Unfortunately for them, most ended up as a tasty snack for the Talas. While running, Choi kept glancing back every now and then to check the distance between himself and the Talas. Each time he looked, it became clear that even a moment's hesitation would mean sharing the same fate as those poor goblins. After what felt like an eternity, Choi found himself standing in front of a massive cave, panting and completely exhausted. He hesitated, wondering if it was safe to go inside and doubting whether it might hold something even more dangerous. Rachel, trying her best to gain his trust, assured him confidently that there was nothing dangerous inside the cave. Choi wasn't entirely convinced, but given the circumstances, he decided to trust her and do as she said, at least for this once. After all, the cave seemed much safer than the forest, where hundreds of Talas were hunting him. Cautiously, he stepped inside, moving slowly through the dark pathway as he tried to get a sense of the cave situation. As he walked, Rachel casually mentioned something that made Choi's eyes widen. She said the cave was so big that even the Queen of the Talas could easily live a long life inside it. He quickly laughed it off, claiming she was just joking and that such a thing would never happen. But that one comment was enough to make Choi more alert. Choi nervously scanned his surroundings, and that's when he spotted something green smeared on the cave wall. Curious but cautious, he approached and touched it, only to recoil in disgust. It felt like fresh spider poop, sticky and foul. Looking further into the cave, he realized that wasn't the only mess. The place was covered in green, slimy droppings, massive spiderwebs, and what looked to be eggs. That's when it hit him. This had to be one of the Tala's nests. Choi froze, his mind racing as he considered his options. Should he get out of there and back into the forest, or try to hide in a corner and hope for the best? As if to force his hand, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, staring straight at him. In that moment, Choi knew exactly what he had to do. Run. Without another second's hesitation, he turned and bolted, sprinting as fast as his legs would carry him. Behind him, the fully grown Talas, just as terrifying as the queen, gave chase. Choi ran wildly, not caring where he went, desperate to avoid being caught. But as he talked to Rachel in panic, he lost focus and stepped on a patch of slimy Tala's poop. His foot slipped, sending him crashing to the ground. Cornered and out of options, Choi grabbed the nearest object, a Tala's egg, and hurled it at the monster. He didn't even realize what he was throwing until he saw the Talas leap into the egg's path, using her body to shield it like a devoted mother. She visibly trembled with relief when she saw her child was unharmed, acting less like a monster and more like a worried parent. Choi, as clueless as ever, stood there in confusion. Why had the Talas suddenly stopped attacking? Why was she so concerned about the egg? He asked Rachel if she had any idea what was going on, but her response was as ridiculous as ever. Maybe she likes what you threw at her because it's round, smooth, and moist. Choi sighed at Rachel's useless input, but as he took a closer look at another egg, the truth dawned on him. These were her children, and that's why she cared about them a lot. Realizing he could use the mother's love to his advantage, Choi picked up another of the large eggs. As he prepared to mess with the ugly but strangely kind mother monster, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. Seeing her egg in the boy's hand, the grown Talas started trembling clearly, terrified he might harm her precious child, but the boy didn't give two flying fuck about her feelings. With the stance of a pro baseball player, hurled it as hard as he could. The Talas moved faster than he expected, catching the egg in midair. Rachel, unusually calm, started commentating like a sports announcer, narrating the bizarre match between Choi and the monstrous Talas. What had started as pure terror now turned into a twisted game. Choi began throwing the Talas' eggs one after another, determined to mess with the poor mother. Surrounded by more than 100 eggs, he was relentless. After a few minutes, the Talas was visibly defeated, having failed to save almost all of her eggs, while Choi mocked her mercilessly. Feeling cocky, he turned to Rachel and asked for another egg, but she, trying not to laugh, told him there were none left. He'd already smashed every single one. Choi froze. He had been so caught up in his amusement that he hadn't noticed just how many eggs he'd destroyed. That was the moment he realized he was in big trouble. With nothing left to hold her back, the Talas let out a furious, dog-like scream and charged straight at him, determined to get revenge for her lost children. Strangely, this time, Choi didn't even try to run. Instead, he calmly asked Rachel to quickly cast an enhancement buff on him. The enraged Talas was only a few meters away, ready to pounce, when Rachel finally managed to cast her basic buff, nervously announcing it was the best she could manage right now. The Talas lunged, but little did she know, Choi had found the courage to stand his ground. With Rachel's enhancement and his own skill, Choi moved with lightning speed, landing a powerful punch directly at the Talas' lower body. The force was so great it punched a new hole straight through her, killing the monster instantly. For a moment, Choi simply stared at his own hand, amazed by what he'd just accomplished. He leveled up 3 times from the single kill. Rachel rushed over, acting all concerned, while Choi, exhausted and panting, told her they needed to find a better place to rest. Soon, they found a peaceful spot to catch their breath. Rachel fussed over him, trying to heal his injured hand, while Choi used the 8 hero points he'd earned to raise his stats, spreading them evenly and feeling great as they balanced out. Just then, a voice called from the darkness. "Is that you, Choi?" Something that definitely caught the boy's attention. He turned to see a huge shadow slowly approaching. It was Chef Culkin, appearing out of nowhere as if nothing had happened. Choi wasn't thrilled to see him, especially after being abandoned. He also couldn't help but wonder how the chef had made it here. Culkin explained that it looked like the same thing that had happened to Choi had happened to him. He'd stumbled upon the cave while fleeing the Tala's army, feeling lucky to find a hiding spot and run into Choi at the same time. Not wanting Culkin to ruin his mood, Choi quickly pointed out that the cave was actually a Tala's nest, mentioning the hundreds of eggs scattered everywhere. To drive his point home, he suggested they both leave immediately. Culkin's eyes widened in shock, but then his demeanor changed. He was overcome with appreciation for the food, much like when Choi fed Bobo. Culkin grabbed a Tala's egg, announcing with excitement that he'd never had the chance to examine such a rare and delicious food, something only the highest level demons could ever dream of tasting. Seeing his reaction, Choi grew furious. He stood up and yelled at the chef, insisting they needed to leave the cave immediately. But Culkin remained carefree, convinced that the swarm of Talas chasing him had already tracked him to the cave and left them with no escape. Having given up hope, Culkin just wanted to enjoy the Tala's egg as his last meal. Suddenly, the sound of chattering echoed from deeper inside. A group of the last remaining goblins, who had accidentally wandered in, appeared. Without even apologizing for abandoning everyone earlier, Culkin casually invited them to join for what he called their last meal before they died. Culkin's words started to get at Choi, making him wonder if this really would be his last meal. But then another thought struck him. He was still a virgin, and the idea of dying a second time without ever experiencing life with his future wife felt unbearable. That realization sparked a fire in Choi's heart. He decided then and there that he would do whatever it took to survive and get everyone out of this nightmare cave alive. Meanwhile, inside Commander Hemis's office, Rhea Drun had just returned from a mission and came to report to her, as usual. Hemis was lounging comfortably in her chair, eyeing Rhea Drun with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. She first teased him for acting so formal again, then got straight to the point and asked if he had completed the mission she'd assigned him. The cadet orc replied that he had successfully captured the Saintess of the Holy Empire, just as instructed. Commander Hemis jumped out of her seat and approached Rhea Drun, praising him for his excellent work. She admitted she hadn't expected him to finish the mission in just 3 weeks. Proud of him, she gently patted his head, causing his face to flush from red to a deep shade of crimson. Just as Hemis was about to make a move on him, her keen demonic senses picked up someone lingering outside her office, attempting to interrupt her moment. It turned out to be a goblin who nervously shuffled in after a stern warning from Hemis. Stammering, the goblin explained that something urgent had happened. His voice trembled as he reported that the cooks had gone hunting for resources but had encountered a disaster. Annoyed that her time might be wasted on what sounded like a trivial issue, Hemis demanded to know what the so-called emergency was. The goblin then revealed the full story. It involved the Queen of the Talas, a deadly encounter, and most of the party being killed, with several still missing. Both Commander Hemis and Rhea Drun froze in shock, realizing the gravity of the situation. While Hemis didn't actually care much about anyone else, Rhea Drun was deeply worried about Choi Hyunseok. He quickly asked the goblin if there was any news about Hyunseok, but the goblin had no solid information. He couldn't say if the boy was alive or not. Meanwhile, back inside the cave, Chef Culkin was having the time of his life, watching the goblins guzzle down Tala's eggs as if it were their last legendary feast. Choi Hyunseok, on the other hand, found the sight unbearable. Without warning, he grabbed something heavy and smashed it onto Culkin's head, yelling at him to pull himself together and not give up. Culkin turned to glare at Hyunseok, completely stunned that the boy had dared to hit him. Confused, he demanded an explanation, only to notice a large book in Hyunseok's hands. Looking more serious than ever, Hyunseok explained that he felt Culkin had fallen under some kind of wicked spell and that he had no choice but to use his secret weapon to snap him out of it. That secret weapon turned out to be an encyclopedia packed with information about demonic beasts, a book Hyunseok had recently acquired, not only to bring Culkin back to his senses, but also to gather crucial information about the Talas. According to the encyclopedia, Talas are spider-like demonic beasts that live in large groups. One of their key features is their particularly sturdy legs, and the best way to kill them is by targeting their heads and torsos. Here's the kicker. Their bodily fluids are extremely flammable, and even their eggs contain a liquid as combustible as a bomb. Hyunseok read all this information out loud, which sparked an idea. He turned to Chef Culkin and asked if, by any chance, he could use fire magic. Culkin, still confused by the sudden question, replied that he could manage basic fire magic, such as shooting small flames. However, Culkin, already resigned to his fate, dismissed Hyunseok's efforts, telling him to give up just like he had. He reminded the boy that his fire magic wouldn't stand a chance against the Talas. Frustrated and disappointed by Culkin's defeatist attitude, Hyunseok declared that his plan wasn't as simple as it seemed. Without warning, he started shouting to grab everyone's attention, determined to share his plan for escape and survival. To get them to listen and cooperate, Hyunseok held up a Tala's egg in his hand and confidently declared that if they managed to escape, they could always return later to enjoy this delicious food. Unfortunately, the first step of his plan failed because everyone was already stuffed with Tala's eggs, so they weren't motivated enough to act. But Hyunseok had a backup plan. He promised that if they managed to escape, he would serve them unlimited gourmet demonic beast meat as a survival celebration. Unlike his first offer, this one completely changed the goblins' minds. Suddenly, they became interested in escaping and surviving. Out of nowhere, Chef Culkin approached Hyunseok and placed a hand on his shoulder, his face lighting up with the same excitement he'd had when he first saw the Tala's eggs. Culkin was ready to cooperate if it meant getting to eat whatever the boy would cook later. Hyunseok was shocked to see the once hopeless chef change his attitude so quickly. Minutes later, when everyone was mentally prepared, Hyunseok began explaining his plan. The first part was simple. They had to run as fast as they could, follow his lead, and not stop under any circumstances. With that, Hyunseok took off running, determined to make it out alive. Behind him, a total of 7 goblins, each a different color, followed closely, and Chef Culkin was first right behind him. Each of them clutched 2 Tala's eggs, as if their lives depended on it. As soon as they left their hideout, they were confronted by a swarm of Talas, some fully grown, most of them smaller offspring. Chef Culkin began summoning his fire magic, just as Hyunseok had instructed. Without hesitation, Hyunseok lit one of the Tala's eggs on fire and hurled it with all his strength. Surprisingly, he didn't target the Talas directly, but the cave's wall. The egg exploded on impact, creating a fiery blast that immediately caught the attention of the Talas. All at once, the spider-like creatures rushed toward the explosion, doing everything they could to stop the fire from spreading. Hyunseok let out a sigh of relief as he saw his plan working. The fully grown Talas would prioritize extinguishing the fire to protect their nest and the rest of their eggs. Taking advantage of the distraction, Hyunseok found an opening and bolted forward, yelling at the others to follow him. As they ran, they used most of the remaining eggs as makeshift bombs to keep the Talas occupied. Unfortunately, along the way, many of their group were caught by the relentless creatures, and there was no way to save them. Hyunseok had no choice but to keep moving, his focus locked on survival. Eventually, they were down to just 1 egg, and Hyunseok was desperately searching for a way out of the cursed cave. Just when things seemed hopeless, Rachel stepped up and pointed out the exit. But before he could fully celebrate, disaster struck. Hyunseok, distracted while talking to the others, was wounded by one of the Talas. Despite the injury, he refused to stop, gritting his teeth and pushing through the pain. He motivated himself with an unconventional thought, dreaming about having babies with Commander Hemis. Somehow, they managed to escape from the swarm of Talas, but only 4 of them were left alive. Seeing the exit up ahead and faint rays of sunlight shining through filled Hyunseok with relief and excitement. For a moment, he thought they were finally safe. But as he got a clearer look, he froze in his tracks. It was the exit, but the Queen Talas herself was blocking the way. Hyunseok couldn't help but compare her to the others. The full-grown Talas they had faced earlier were like harmless rabbits compared to this monstrous bear. The sheer size and ferocity of the queen made both Hyunseok and Chef Culkin question if this was the end of their journey. To make things worse, the distant sound of more Talas closing in echoed through the cave, adding to the pressure. Hyunseok clenched the last remaining egg tightly in his fist, his mind racing. The Queen Talas locked her gaze on him, clearly enraged by the sight of him gripping the egg so tightly it was almost cracking. Chef Culkin, on the other hand, sank back into despair, muttering that trying to escape had been pointless. But Hyunseok refused to give up. He had already noticed something important. The queen hadn't attacked them yet, even after spotting them. It didn't take long for him to figure out why. She wasn't attacking because of the egg in his hand. With this realization, Hyunseok acted quickly. In a sudden move, he tore off one of his sleeves, shouting to grab the queen's full attention. At the same time, he turned to Culkin and urgently asked him to light up the piece of cloth. Culkin stood frozen, completely shocked, but decided to trust Hyunseok and followed his lead. Threatening the queen, Hyunseok raised the egg as high as he could and brought the burning cloth closer to it, loudly declaring that it was the last remaining egg out of hundreds that had once been in the cave. He made it crystal clear. If she didn't step aside and let them go, he would use the egg as a bomb and collapse the entire cave, killing all her precious offspring before she could harm them. The queen didn't take it well. She either didn't understand what Hyunseok was saying or simply didn't care to cooperate. She let out a scream, but didn't budge an inch. Still, Hyunseok wasn't backing down. He repeated his threat, insisting he wasn't bluffing, but the queen refused to yield, standing her ground and glaring at him with unrelenting rage. Truthfully, Hyunseok was bluffing. He knew one egg couldn't possibly destroy the entire cave, but with no other options, he decided to take his chances. He lit the egg on fire and hurled it deep into the cave with all his strength. What happened next was nothing short of bizarre. The egg hit one of the cave's main pillars and exploded. To everyone's shock, the explosion caused cracks that immediately began spreading across the cave like wildfire. Soon, the ground began to shake as if an earthquake were about to tear everything apart. The goblins were the first to realize the danger. Moments later, Hyunseok also realized that the cave really was collapsing, just like the bluff he had made earlier to scare the queen. Without wasting any time, he started running and yelled for the others to do the same, hoping they could escape past the queen before the entire cave came crashing down. Meanwhile, more Talas arrived, either trying to save themselves or still determined to chase after Hyunseok and his group. Out of nowhere, a massive stone fell from above, crushing one of the Talas that had been chasing him. The creature was killed instantly. Hyunseok froze as a strange sensation washed over him. He had leveled up. He stood there stunned, trying to figure out why. He hadn't even landed the killing blow. Rachel, on the other hand, was doing everything she could to snap him out of it. She grabbed his hair and shouted at him, trying to pull him toward the exit. But something even stranger happened. Right in front of him, another gigantic rock crashed down, this time onto another fully grown Talas, killing it instantly. Once again, Hyunseok leveled up without lifting a finger. As the collapse sped up, shaking the deeper parts of the cave, his experience points seemed to skyrocket. He began leveling up again and again, so quickly he couldn't even keep count. Each kill caused by the falling rocks sent a surge of energy through him, mesmerizing him. By this point, everyone else had dashed past him, racing toward the exit. Hyunseok was still standing there, completely captivated by the endless stream of level-ups. He was so overwhelmed by it all that he failed to realize the obvious. If he didn't keep moving, he'd be the next victim of the collapsing cave. Slowly, everything began to make sense to Choi Hyunseok. The shock boy realized he was gaining all these kill experiences because he was the one who had caused the cave to collapse. Finally, Hyunseok decided to run outside before he met the same fate as those monstrous spiders. To maximize his chances of survival, he called out to Rachel, asking her to use a speed-enhancing buff on him. She obliged immediately, while the fact that he had managed to survive all this chaos warmed Choi's heart, making him try his best. But the biggest problem remained, figuring out how to avoid the Tala's queen before the cave completely collapsed. The only idea that came to mind was that he needed to distract the queen, even for just a moment. Just then, his eyes caught a surprising sight. Chef Culkin was approaching the queen, holding out a Tala's egg and begging her to let them go in exchange. It looked as if Culkin had been hiding the egg as a backup, but now he was offering it to buy both his life and their freedom. However, that wasn't the case. Chef Culkin was actually sacrificing both his treasured food and, above all, his life to buy Hyunseok a little time to escape. Unlike before, when the queen hesitated against Hyunseok while he held her egg, this time she didn't pause for even a second. With a swift, merciless strike, she stabbed Culkin with one of her sharp legs, killing the brave chef without hesitation. Hyunseok was horrified as he watched the scene unfold. He kept running, powerless to stop the tragedy, but he swore to himself he would do everything in his power to escape so that Culkin's death would not be in vain. With the queen finished with the goblins and Culkin, she now had only one person left to exact vengeance upon for the massacre of her offspring. Before she could find the boy, Hyunseok spotted an opening between her massive legs. Without wasting a second, he sprinted forward, managing to slip under the queen's enormous body, praying he would pass unnoticed. Unfortunately, the Tala's queen quickly realized what was happening. Instead of using her enormous bulk like the other spiders, she spat a sticky green web straight from her mouth, aiming to snare him. She managed to grab hold of Hyunseok's hand just as he was about to escape. Hyunseok hadn't anticipated being caught, and the moment it happened, he felt a sinking sense of doom, as if this would be the end of his second life's journey. As the queen prepared to finish him off, someone suddenly intervened, stopping her attack mere inches before she could strike the killing blow. To Hyunseok's shock, it was Ryujun. Out of nowhere, the cadet orc had appeared, so concerned for Hyunseok's fate that he had personally come to save him at the perfect time. Hyunseok was stunned. He had expected anything except being rescued by Ryujun. With a confident grin, Ryujun said he knew Hyunseok wouldn't die so easily and was glad to see him alive. He told Hyunseok to relax, assuring him that he would handle things from here. Despite the queen still having 7 other legs to fight with, she seemed completely overpowered and pinned by Ryujun, unable to move an inch. With a sudden, overwhelming display of strength, Ryujun broke one of the queen's legs, cracks spreading rapidly through the chitinous limb. The Tala's queen let out an ear-piercing scream, overwhelmed by the unbearable pain. The terrifying and seemingly unstoppable monster from just moments ago now looked as though she was teetering on the edge of defeat. A little farther away, Ryudrun stood protectively in front of Hyunseok, a total badass and guardian, his stance and powerful aura radiating heroism. To Hyunseok, he seemed nothing less than his absolutely awesome savior. What had started as a day of peaceful routine ended with only 6 survivors out of the original 105 kitchen members. Back inside the castle, Hyunseok lay sprawled on the ground, completely drained, while Bobo, now much larger than before, sat on top of him, whimpering and whining in protest at having been left alone for so long. Exhausted, Hyunseok simply let Bobo do as he pleased, too tired to resist the dog's excited reunion. Rachel watched from a safe distance, remarking on how lucky they were to have escaped that nightmare, all thanks to Ryudrun's timely intervention. Hyunseok agreed, but only partially. He reminded Rachel that in just a few days he would have to face a towering orc with a battle strength of 6,000, a fight he believed would be his certain death. Unlike the hopeless Hyunseok, Rachel wasn't fazed. She reminded him that he had grown much stronger in just a single day, and there was no reason to think he couldn't survive against his powerful opponent, even though Hyunseok still doubted himself. According to his status window, he had gained 75 levels in one go thanks to the cave's collapse. He was now at level 200, and his battle strength had more than doubled in a single day. But even with that tremendous boost, both knew it was still only half of his opponent's power. Rachel then asked a curious question. Would Hyunseok gain orc-like strength if he reached 6,000 battle strength? Uncertain, Hyunseok replied that he thought it likely depended on more than just the numbers. Rachel had asked to draw the conclusion that for Hyunseok to win his upcoming duel, he would need to use magic, not just physical strength. Magic, she believed, would dramatically improve his chances of victory. Hyunseok, however, wasn't exactly familiar with magic and thought it was easier said than done. Trying to help him understand, Rachel declared that he had already used magic, specifically during the moment he dashed toward that full-grown Talas and finished it off in a single strike. However, Choi had no idea what she was talking about. He didn't even know if he'd ever used magic before, but Rachel's words stuck with him, prompting him to think harder. Slowly, he began to wonder if that sudden surge of power he had felt at that critical moment was indeed the magic she was referring to. Before they could reach any conclusion, the door creaked open and Ryudrun stepped into Bobo's room, startling them both. Rachel instantly vanished into thin air to avoid being seen, while Hyunseok awkwardly asked what brought Ryudrun to such a humble place. The once easygoing cadet orc's expression shifted to serious, and in a firm, commanding tone, he declared that Hyunseok needed to follow him to meet Commander Hemis. Moments, or perhaps minutes, later, they arrived at Hemis's office. After receiving permission to enter, she looked surprised to see Ryudrun, especially since he described his visit as something personal. She couldn't help but wonder what this was about. Ryudrun politely asked for Hemis's permission to personally train Hyunseok in the art of battle, something Hyunseok himself hadn't expected to hear. This request made Hemis even more curious, as she wanted to know why Ryudrun, of all people, was so willing to personally train human. Ryudrun's reason was simple. He knew Hyunseok's opponent was far stronger, and since he liked the boy, he didn't want to see him die so easily. He had seen something in Hyunseok, his potential. It was enough to make Ryudrun want to personally ensure the boy's success. Hyunseok was completely stunned, struggling to process it all, certain that Commander Hemis would never allow Ryudrun to train him. But to his shock, she agreed without hesitation, probably because she cared so much for Ryudrun that she couldn't say no to him. After granting them what they wanted, Hemis dismissed them, saying she had other matters to attend to. They left as ordered, but just before stepping out, Hyunseok turned back to express his gratitude for Commander Hemis's wise decision, as if he truly wanted to be trained by Ryudrun. As they exited, a thought crossed Hemis's mind. She could read Hyunseok like an open book. She wondered how he had managed to grow more than twice as strong since the last time she saw him. It amused her to see someone who could grow so fast, but at the same time, it irritated her. Hemis knew that if Ryudrun stepped in to train the boy, his victory would become almost certain. To make things more balanced, or perhaps out of spite for Hyunseok's rapid success, she decided she would take action from the shadows. The orc with his bull-like head wasted no time dragging Hyunseok to his personal training field. Choi, wide-eyed with curiosity, glanced around, wondering if Ryudrun really used this massive space all by himself just to train. While Choi was busy taking in the surroundings, Ryodrun's attention was fixed squarely on him. As much as Choi was intrigued by the training ground, Ryodrun was equally curious about this unusual boy standing behind him. The orc could sense that Choi's body brimmed with an overwhelming amount of mana, yet something was off. Why couldn't the boy properly channel such raw energy? Like Commander Hemis, Ryodrun had also noticed how much stronger Choi had grown in such a ridiculously short amount of time. It was impossible to ignore. No matter how goofy and unassuming the boy looked initially, Ryodrun couldn't discount what he sensed. At first, he planned to start with the basics, easing Choi into proper training. But with only 4 days left before Choi's big battle, there was no time for baby steps. Out of nowhere, while Choi was completely lost in his usual wandering and often inappropriate daydreams, Ryodrun suddenly spun around and threw a punch straight at his face. It wasn't out of anger, it was all part of the training. Choi, still caught up in his thoughts, didn't even have time to react. The blow landed clean, snapping him back to reality. "Focus!" Ryodrun barked, towering over him. Choi staggered back, clutching his face in both shock and fury. "What the hell was that for?" he shouted, glaring up at the orc. His mind raced, trying to understand why Ryodrun was beating him up for no reason, especially when he claimed he wanted to train him. The orc didn't give Choi time to process what was happening. Before he could think, Ryodrun launched another attack, this time shouting for him to block using mana. Choi scrambled to defend himself and, to his credit, managed to block the incoming strike, but he only used his physical strength. Even though he successfully stopped the attack, the sheer force sent him skidding several meters backward, feet dragging through the dirt. Ryodrun, standing tall before him, couldn't help but feel a little weird about the whole thing. How had this guy managed to block my kick? The cadet orc didn't know it yet, but Choi had been a professional fighter in his previous life. To Ryodrun, the boy's reflexes, reaction time, and sharp vision were at a completely different level compared to any ordinary hero in this world. His suspicions deepened as he observed Choi's fighting stance. The way he shifted so quickly from shock to deadly seriousness was a dead giveaway. It all started to click. This boy wasn't just some clueless, weakling hero. There was something exceptional about him. Fueled by this realization, Ryodrun decided to push him harder. If Choi could handle more than he initially thought, there was no point in holding back. Like an enraged bull, the orc charged forward at full force, roaring as he closed the distance, and yelling at Choi to start using mana if he ever wanted to stand a chance against that motherfucker, Kirkin. Without holding back, Ryodrun lowered his head and used his massive horns to slam into Choi with a crushing blow. The impact was brutal, sending the boy flying high into the air like a rag doll. Ryodrun stood firm, his deep voice booming. "I'd rather see you die here learning how to use mana than watch you get humiliated and defeated in front of everyone." While flying helplessly through the air, pain radiating through every inch of his body, Choi was absolutely certain of one thing. Ryodrun wasn't joking. The orc was either going to teach him to fight properly or beat him to death trying. But Ryodrun wasn't about to give him a moment to rest. The big, bull-headed orc leaped after him through the air, determined to keep the pressure on. This time, though, Choi wasn't going to just sit there and take a beating. Instead of waiting for the inevitable pain, he twisted midair and launched himself back toward Ryodrun. Whether it was an act of bravery, desperation, or sheer stupidity, even Choi didn't know. All he knew was that he was either going to take the orc down or go down swinging. Then something incredible happened. As he clenched his fist, a faint blue aura began to glow around it. Just before their attacks collided, he sent a quick, frantic prayer to every god he could think of. "Please don't let me die a virgin a second time." Their clash was explosive, like a meteor smashing into the earth. Dust and debris flew everywhere, and a shockwave rippled through the air. At first, it seemed like Choi had gained the upper hand. But in reality, the truth was far less glamorous. Choi was lying unconscious on the ground, battered and bruised, while Rachel frantically tried to shake him awake. The boy was out cold, his body completely spent. Ryodrun, on the other hand, stood tall and unharmed, not a single scratch on him. He approached the fallen hero, his massive frame casting a shadow over the pair. Rachel, sensing danger, bolted before the orc could catch her. Looking down at Choi, Ryodrun smirked and said, "Congratulations. You finally managed to use mana." There was a hint of approval in his tone. Choi, barely clinging to consciousness, with a shaky arm, he raised his trembling hand into the air and slowly formed his fingers into a weak but determined thumbs up. Whether it was aimed at Ryodrun the gods, or just himself from managing to survive. Riadrun felt a wave of relief wash over him as he realized Choi might actually have shot at winning now. Without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed the boy's hand. "Stay still." Gripping Choi's hand tightly, he declared, "Let me heal your injuries." But the moment Riadrun began using his healing magic, something went terribly wrong. Almost instantly, Choi felt as if his entire body was being ripped apart from the inside. Every muscle screamed in agony. His lungs felt crushed, and he couldn't even draw a proper breath. It was as if someone was choking the life out of him. Riadrun froze, wide-eyed, as he watched Choi writhe in agony. Realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. He had made a grave mistake. He'd forgotten a crucial fact. Demons like him use dark mana for their magic, and for humans, dark mana is nothing short of deadly poison. Cursing himself under his breath for being so careless, Riadrun quickly stopped the spell. Without wasting another second, he scooped up Choi's limp, lifeless body and started running towards safety. A rare sense of guilt settled in his chest. In this world, there are three primary forces that govern all magic and power: dark mana, regular mana, and divine power. Each counters another, creating a balance. Dark mana counters regular mana counters divine power, and divine power counters dark mana. Mana is the natural energy humans use. Dark mana belongs to demons and is infused with corruption, making it inherently dangerous to humans. Divine power is reserved for those who worship the gods and is a natural enemy to dark mana. This world was once a place of peace, where people lived their lives without fear or conflict. But that tranquility didn't last. One day, the Church of Theosis, known for having the largest congregation across the land, sparked a devastating religious war. Their ruthless goal: to bring every other religion under their control. When the bloodshed ceased, the Church of Theosis had emerged victorious, consolidating their power and rebranding themselves as the Divine Empire. Gatrongan's influence spread like wildfire, and their claim to divine authority became absolute. One day, they discovered someone who claimed to hear the voice of God. Wasting no time, the church exalted her as their saintess, a holy figure to be revered by all. Now, let's shift focus to the present. A silver-haired girl sat quietly in her dimly lit room, her sharp ears picking up the hushed voices of two individuals in the corridor. They were deep in conversation, talking about the saintess, about her. Her name was Abelson Maria, and she was the newly chosen saintess of the Divine Empire. It was unusual company for her to overhear. The muffled voices belonged to a pair of goblins of all things. They whispered to each other, questioning if the girl in the next room was really a saintess. One wondered why she hadn't prayed in several days. The other doubted whether someone like her could truly be divine. Despite the goblins' doubts and remarks, Abelson herself had an entirely different perspective. Yes, she was a saintess, or so the church had told her. Saintesses were supposed to be able to communicate with God, to hear his voice and behave as his vessel. But to Abelson, there was no point in praying to a god she couldn't even believe in anymore. She saw no meaning in the endless rituals and hollow sermons. In fact, deep down, she'd rather be right here, imprisoned in demon territory, than return to that cursed church where her life felt like nothing more than an illusion. Just then, the door burst open without warning. It was Riadrun, the cadet orc. His steps were heavy, his expression grim, and in his arms he cradled the lifeless body of Choi. Without wasting a moment, Riadrun locked eyes with Abelson and barked, "Saintess, I need your help." Abelson found it disrespectful for a man to enter her room unannounced, but Riadrun insisted it was an emergency and that she needed to heal the boy before it was too late. Meanwhile, deep in his subconscious, Choi felt like he was drowning in eternal darkness, wondering what Riadrun had done to make him feel this way. Then he noticed a soft hand holding his. He was sure it couldn't be Riadrun's rough, manly hand, and started wondering if it was Rachel's. Soon, Choi regained consciousness, and the first thing he saw was a silver-haired girl. He immediately assumed he must have died again and that another angel had come to greet him. Even though he was awake, he seemed a bit out of his mind, blaming Rachel for his short second life and swearing he would never forgive her. Saintess Abelson watched him, confused, as Choi ranted about Rachel, calling her a devil disguised as an angel and begging God to send her to eternal hell. Assuming he'd eventually be reincarnated as a hero again, Choi, still half-conscious, asked the saintess to marry him, saying it was the only way he'd agree to play the role of a hero again. It didn't take long for him to realize he wasn't dead and definitely wasn't talking to an angel, especially after Abelson called him a disgusting, pathetic fool, which pretty much confirmed it. Choi looked even more confused, glancing around to figure out who he had actually been talking to. Before he could process anything, Riedrun grabbed him by the collar and hugged him so tightly it felt like his bones might break, clearly overjoyed that Choi was okay. Crushed in Riedrun's iron grip, Choi couldn't help but wonder what was going on, and more importantly, why he wasn't dead. As he tried to get a better look at Sanus Abelson, it finally hit him. He had been rambling all that nonsense in front of an actual person. Riedrun, still looking worried, turned to Abelson and asked if Choi was completely free of the dark mana. She shook her head and replied, "Not fully." Meanwhile, Choi was crying internally and regretting his earlier behavior, especially after hearing the Sanus explain that the dark mana wouldn't leave his body so easily. Riedrun, unable to hold back, asked Abelson why she couldn't remove all of it, even though she possessed divine powers. In response, Abelson calmly declared that she could, but if something went wrong, Choi would actually die for real this time. However, she also added that the dark mana would gradually fade on its own over time, so there wasn't much to worry about. To make up for his mistake and the pain Choi was enduring because of him, Riedrun decided to take the boy back to the training field and teach him something actually useful this time. When Abelson overheard Riedrun talking about training, her curiosity was immediately piqued. She couldn't help but wonder who this human was that was being trained by a high-level demon. Hours later, Bobo was holding a battered and bruised Choi by the head, playfully tugging at him like a toy. From what Choi had heard earlier, Bobo apparently ate every soldier who came to feed it today and managed to destroy its house in just half a day when Choi wasn't around. Despite everything, Choi still found the strength to thank Bobo, because if it wasn't for that crazy dog, Riedrun wouldn't have let him off the hook without training him to the brink of death. Choi was torn, partly happy to have been trained, but mostly miserable from everything he'd endured that day, especially with the dark mana still writhing inside him. Completely exhausted and with no energy left to even stand, Choi turned to Rachel, hoping to ask if the dark mana might eventually kill him. But before he could get an answer, he realized there was something wrong with Rachel. Rachel was sitting in a corner, crying like a 2-year-old, complaining to her god about how her hero was once again ruined and corrupted, just when she thought things were finally looking hopeful.